I'd like to present our speaker for this afternoon, His Eminence Metropolitan Hilarion of the Russian Orthodox Church. At present, he is the Metropolitan of Volokholamsk. He's chairman of the Department of External Church Relations of the Russian Orthodox Church and permanent member of the Holy Synod of the Patriarchate of Moscow. Recently, he was appointed as rector of the newly established St. Cyril and St. Methodius Postgraduate Theological Institute of the Moscow Patriarchate. Metropolitan Hilarion studied at the University of Oxford under the supervision of Metropolitan Kallistos, and in only 2 years he was awarded the degree of Doctor of Philosophy for his dissertation on St. Symeon the New Theologian. He is a noted theologian himself, a church historian, and a composer, and the author of over 700 publications, including monographs on patristics, dogmatic theology, church history, and he's also translated works by church fathers from Greek and Syriac into Russian. It's not an exaggeration to say that the musical compositions of Metropolitan Hilarion are among the most widely performed works of all living Russian composers. His St. Matthew Passion, written in 2006, has received wide recognition throughout the world, and since its premiere in 2007, it's been performed more than 70 times in different countries. In fact, the first London performance will take place tomorrow evening at the Cadogan Hall in Belgravia. But now we shall hear him speak on another topic. It's on St. Symeon the New Theologian and the Studite tradition. Very welcome.
Your Eminence, your Graces, dear brothers and sisters, 20 years have elapsed since, under the supervision of Metropolitan Kallistos, I wrote and defended a thesis on the relationship between St. Symeon the New Theologian and Orthodox tradition. In this thesis, I made an attempt to determine the place of St. Symeon in Orthodox tradition, to find his spiritual roots, and to compare his teaching with that of the fathers before him. I focused to a considerable extent on those aspects of his theology which at that time did not attract sufficient attention. Symeon's biblical approach, that is, his understanding of scriptures and his exegetical method, had never been considered. His attitude towards the liturgy and the influence the liturgical texts made on him were not studied. His place in the Studite monastic tradition was not defined. The personality of his spiritual father, Symeon the Studite, still remained obscure. The connection between Symeon the New Theologian and patristic tradition as a whole was only partly clarified. Symeon's knowledge of hagiographical literature and its influence on him were not examined. Some important parts of his own doctrine, such as his anthropology and his triadology, were left aside by scholars. Some of these gaps I wanted to fill in by my study of the relationship between Symeon and the Orthodox tradition. Symeon the New Theologian is one of the most outstanding fathers of the Eastern Church. He is now commonly regarded as a great mystic of fire and light, a forerunner of Byzantine hesychasm. Some scholars call him the greatest of the Byzantine mystical writers. Others speak of his tremendous relevance for modern man. Almost 10 centuries after his death, his teachings on the vision of God as light, on sanctity and dispassion, on ecstasy and deification still attract many Christians who find inspiration in his writings. Yet Symeon is also one of the most controversial writers of the entire Christian tradition. His teaching was subject to heated debates not only during his lifetime, but also after his death. His works were never forgotten and were in fact quite popular among the Orthodox monks of many centuries. Outside the monastic milieu, however, his name was until recently hardly mentioned even by scholars in Byzantine history and culture. The rediscovery of Symeon is a relatively recent phenomenon. Although Symeon is now considered by Byzantine scholars to be one of the most important objects of study, the literature on him is still limited. In modern scholarship, Symeon has been presented as a prominent mystical writer, but his relationship to tradition was not fully investigated. The interest in Symeon primarily as a mystic, with the underestimation of the traditional character of his teaching, might be explained partly by the Western influence on the modern scholarly approach to Symeon. There is a tendency among scholars to present him as a writer whose conceptions smacked of Messianism or contained doubtful orthodoxy and were close to Protestantism. One scholar even found in Symeon's chapters a startling similarity to Neopolitan and Bogomil beliefs. It is obvious that Symeon's own mystical experience was a primary source of his theological and literary inspiration. It is also true that Symeon had a conflict with the representatives of the official church of his time. This makes his case somewhat similar to that of some Western mystics. But was Symeon really attempting to oppose his personal experience to experience of the church and place it above all the doctrines of traditional orthodoxy? Should his conflict be regarded as a clash between him and tradition, or was it in fact a debate about the nature of the tradition itself, which was understood in different ways by Symeon and by his opponents? It is my conviction that in Symeon we find a mysticism which is absolutely traditional in the Orthodox sense of the term. And I believe that what is very important for Symeon is his monastic background, which was dominated by the practice and ideas of the famous Studite monastery. And his spiritual father, Symeon the Studite, also exercised a great influence on him. In what follows, I will speak about the relationship between Symeon the New Theologian and the Studite monastic tradition, with special emphasis on his spiritual father, Symeon the Studite, or Symeon the Pious. The Studite monastery played a decisive role in Saint Symeon's life. Here he met his spiritual father, whose influence on him was enormous. Here he began his own monastic path. From here, because of his disobedience towards the abbot, he was expelled eventually to become abbot himself in another monastery of the same tradition and type. The Studion, the Studite monastery, was Symeon the New Theologian's spiritual homeland, and we shall not come to understand his monastic achievements without first looking at what this monastery meant for him and for Byzantine monasticism in general. The monastery was founded in the middle of the 5th century, but it is only during the iconoclastic epoch that it became one of the most significant centers of Byzantine monasticism. The monastery and its abbot, Theodore the Studite, played a decisive role in the struggle against iconoclasm, and after the final victory over iconoclasm, its authority was extraordinarily high. The unique history of the Studite monastery its location in the center of the Byzantine capital, its significance for the defense of the veneration of icons, its liturgical and hymnographical activity, its role in the spiritual direction of people, its influence on Byzantine politics, its richness and grandeur, and of course, the great personalities of Saint Theodore and other abbots and elders. All these factors gave it the central position which the monastery occupied in Byzantine monasticism for centuries. The influence of the Studite monastery was very strong not only in the area of Constantinople, but also quite far beyond its boundaries, for example, on Mount Athos or in Russia. So we are entitled to speak of the Studite tradition as a whole complex of features which were characteristic of Byzantine monasticism in the period before Saint Symeon the New Theologian. One of the most important features of this tradition was the educational activity of the Studite monks. This is important for us because Symeon the New Theologian and his spiritual father Symeon the Studite were directly involved in it, both as spiritual directors and writers, the first also as a copyist and organizer of a library. The spectrum of the educational activity in the Studite monastery and other communities belonging to its circle was very wide. The monastery possessed a rich library. The art of calligraphy was developed in the Studite monastery, and the origin of the minuscule script is connected with this monastery. It was introduced for the purpose of cabinet study as opposed to reading out loud. Another aspect of the Studite tradition, which should be mentioned, is the enormous activity of the Studite monks in the spiritual direction of both monks and lay people. Inside the monastery, the abbot himself was usually the spiritual father of all the monks. The Studite hypotyposis prescribes daily revelation of thoughts, that is, confession before the abbot. If the daily confession of monks existed in both early and later monasticism, the practice of the monastic direction of lay people is especially characteristic of the iconoclastic epoch, at least on a large scale. The beginning of the institution of elders, whose main task was to confess lay people, is connected with this practice. Of course, the elders who directed lay people existed before iconoclasm as well, but their social importance and influence had grown enormously during that particular period. To understand the nature of this institution, which has existed in the Eastern Church up to the present time, one must take into consideration historical circumstances which caused its development in the iconoclastic period. As Metropolitan Kallistos Ware points out, within the life of the Church there are two forms of apostolic succession. I quote, "First, there is the visible succession of the hierarchy, the unbroken series of bishops in different cities. Alongside this, largely hidden, existing on a charismatic rather than an official level, there is secondly the apostolic succession of the spiritual fathers and mothers in each generation of the Church." End quote. If these two types of succession usually coexist in peace and in most cases merge together, when the bishops and priests are spiritual directors of people, in the iconoclastic epoch there arose a polarization between them. The reason was the distinct fall in authority of the official hierarchy in the eyes of the people because of the collaboration of its members with iconoclasts. When such a high number of representatives of the clergy became renegades, people turned to the monks in whom they saw the defenders of orthodoxy. Those Studite sources do not speak of the spiritual direction of lay people as a special monastic service, and do not appear to have initiated a special post of the confessor of people. This service, in fact, existed since this time, and many monks were involved in it. There was, of course, strong opposition to this custom on the part of the hierarchy and canonists, and finally it almost disappeared in the Eastern Church. But in the time between Theodore the Studite and Symeon the New Theologian, it existed and was becoming more and more widespread. Symeon the New Theologian, spiritual father, Symeon the Studite, was one of the representatives of the institution of elders. In the life of his great disciple, he occupied an enormously important place. Symeon the New Theologian is probably unique in that the three principal external events of his life, his becoming a monk at Studion, his transfer to another monastery, and finally his exile, were all due to his extraordinary devotion to his spiritual director. The greatest interior event which changed the whole of Symeon's life, his first mystical illumination by the divine light, is also due to the influence of Symeon the Studite. Through the latter, Symeon the New Theologian was introduced to monastic life in general and to the Studite monastic tradition in particular. During Symeon the Elder's lifetime, Symeon the Younger greatly admired him, and after his death immediately began to venerate him as a saint. All these facts impel us to pay particular attention to Symeon the Studite's personality and teaching. Why was he able to exert such a great influence on his disciple? What was the nature of their relationship? Was it just a personal friendship, or can Symeon the Studite also be considered as a direct predecessor of Symeon the New Theologian in some aspects of the latter's ascetical and mystical approach? To answer these questions, one has to analyze all the existing evidence on Symeon the Studite's personality and writings. To begin with, let me quote the passage from Symeon the New Theologian's 16th Catechetical Discourse, which is regarded as autobiographical. This text provides valuable, though fragmentary, information on Symeon the Studite. I was the novice of a venerable father, who was equal to the great and exalted saints, says Saint Symeon in this discourse. It happened that one day we were going into the city in which he lived to visit his spiritual children. We spent the whole day among them, for there were many whom he helped even by his presence alone. At evening we came back to our cell, hungry and thirsty from much labor and the heat, because even though the day was hot, he was not accustomed to take the slightest nap, in spite of his age, though he was about 60 years old. Symeon the New Theologian entered the Studite monastery when he was 27, and Symeon the Studite at that time was about 60. We learn from the passage that the Studite, though not a priest, had many spiritual children and was regarded as an elder. The very fact that he was allowed to visit them, spending the whole day outside the monastery, shows that he was respected not only by his adherents, but also by the monastery authorities. Continuing his story, Symeon gives us a piece of information concerning the Studite's ascetical approach and methods of his spiritual direction. Having returned to the cell after an exhausting day, the young Symeon did not want to eat, because he thought he would not be able to stand for prayer. But the elder told him to eat without any embarrassment. So, Symeon writes, we ate and drank even more than necessary, for he also ate condescending to my weakness. Then, when the meal was finished, he told me, Know this, child, that it is neither fasting, nor vigil, nor bodily effort, nor any other laudable action that pleases God, but only the humble, simple, and good soul and heart. The disciple marveled at what he heard, and having bowed down, asked for the elder's prayers. Before he left, he was told by the elder merely to recite the Trisagion and to go to sleep. Then, when Symeon returned to his own place and started to recite the Trisagion, a mystical illumination took place, when he saw the divine light and his elder within it. We learn from this story that Symeon the Studite was not a rigorist in ascetical matters. He would allow himself and his disciple to eat even more than necessary and recite only a short prayer before sleep instead of the usual quite long rule of prayers. These two pieces of evidence correspond to the ascetical discourse written by Symeon the Studite, the only surviving work of his, where he recommends to the disciple to eat everything which is offered and to drink wine, and refers to the Trisagion before sleep when saying, "It is better to recite with attention merely one Trisagion and go to sleep, than to spend 4 hours in vigil with useless chatting." It's a quotation. The ease with which the Studite sometimes allowed his disciple to relax ascetical discipline does not mean, of course, that he was not himself an ascetic and a man of prayer. It only means that he did not put bodily effort in first place, but emphasized the need for humility and simplicity in order to achieve mystical experience. Symeon the New Theologian speaks of his elder's own deep mystical life, testifying that he had visions of divine light. In the same 16 catechetical discourse, Symeon mentions that he often heard from his spiritual father of divine illuminations sent from heaven to the ascetics, of floods of light, and of conversations between God and man thereby. In another discourse, Symeon describes his talk with Symeon the Studite, after the first vision of light, as a dialogue between one who has just received his first mystical experience and one who has possessed it for a long time. If there exists someone who has explained this to him before, since he has already come to know God, he comes to that person and tells him, "I have seen." The elder asks, "What did you see, my child?" "A light, my father, a sweet, sweet light, and my mind does not know how to describe it to you. At once the space of my cell vanished and the whole world disappeared. I was left alone with this light. There was ineffable joy, which is still in me, and great love and desire, so that streams of tears flowed out of me, as you see now." And the elder answers and tells him, "It is he, my child." Such a mysticism was what attracted the young Symeon to Symeon the Studite. One may suppose that this, together with the gift of healing which he possessed, was what gained him many other spiritual children. Symeon the Studite seems not to have been highly educated. Symeon speaks of his spiritual father as one who has not received grammar lessons. And Nikitas Stithatos, Symeon the New Theologian's disciple, calls Symeon the Studite unlettered. Nikitas also tells us that Symeon the Studite spent 45 years in monastic life and possessed gifts of healing and miraculous powers. The exact year of his death is not known. The only information with which Nikitas provides us is that between the death of Symeon the Studite and Symeon the New Theologian's conflict with Stephen of Nicomedia, 16 years passed. It is therefore clear that the Studite had died by the end of the 10th century. In the ascetical discourse, which, as I said, is the only surviving writing of the Studite, we are not dealing with a coherent narration, but with an assortment of disconnected passages. The narrative is intended only for monks, and moreover for those living within the monastery walls and not for solitaries. In manuscripts, the work begins with the word adelphe, brother, and the second person singular is employed throughout the discourse. This may mean that it was addressed to a concrete disciple of the Studite. One wonders whether the addressee of the discourse was not Symeon. For us, the discourse is of special importance because we find in it several motifs which were to become characteristic of Symeon. The theme of tears and compunction is a leitmotif of the whole work. The Studite constantly returns to it. In particular, he speaks about the necessity to partake of Holy Communion with tears. He also speaks of many tears during evening prayer in the cell, and of the necessity to pray in the cell with contrition, attention, and unceasing weeping. So, according to him, weeping should be constant. Have unceasing weeping and do not grow satisfied with your tears. One must weep not only for oneself, but also for other people. Through mourning, a man purifies himself from passions, says the Studite. Prayer with tears teaches a man all the virtues. At the same time, the virtues and ascetical efforts promote compunction and tears. For the Studite, weeping is directly connected with what he calls divine illumination, that is, with mystical experience. Where there is contrition with spiritual weeping, there is also divine illumination, says the Studite. Try to purify yourself from passions through tears, he advises, so that having been illuminated by grace, you reach the blessing of the pure in heart. If tears cause divine illumination, the illumination itself, according to him, produces spiritual joy and tears of compunction. The Studite speaks about prayer in his ascetical discourse. It is necessary, he says, to have the mind always with God, both in sleep and in waking hours, during meals and conversations, in manual labor and every other activity, according to the prophet's word, I have set the Lord always before me. Several examples of practical advice concerning evening and night prayer are provided by the Studite in his ascetical discourse. Though he admits that in exceptional cases the evening prayer can be limited to the reciting of the Trisagion, in general he recommends not to shorten evening prayer, even if one is very tired after a lot of labor. However much, he says, a man gets tired in labor, if he is deprived of prayer, let him know that he has lost something great. As to night prayer, the Studite suggests the following order of vigil. In the hours of vigil, it is useful for you to recite some 2 hours and to pray 2 hours in compunction with tears, and then read a canon, whichever you want, and 12 psalms, if you want, and the undefiled, which is Psalm 118, and the prayer of Saint Eustratius. This is when nights are long, and when they are short, the rule is shorter, according to the strength given to you by God. So the whole monastic vigil must take some 6 hours. This means a monk should not sleep at all in the night of vigil. In the Studite monastery, the break between Compline and morning office must have not been more than 6 hours. The remarks "which you want" and "if you want," referring respectively to the canon and 12 sons, show that the Studite left to the disciples' discretion whether to shorten or change the structure of his monastic vigil. There are also two cases which may occur during one's prayer, which are discussed by the Studite. First, he warns against false visions of light during prayer. If, when you are praying, there is any anxiety or knocking, or light flashes up, or something else happens, do not fear, but pray even more zealously. For it can happen that worry and anxiety and ecstasy are demonic. Another case which is discussed by the Studite is what to do if someone comes when you are praying. You must interrupt your prayer, open the door, speak with him, and console him, for the consolation of those who come is equal to reconciliation with God. The Studite, however, suggests not to open the door to lay people, but only to monks. With lay people, one ought to speak after finishing prayer. When the visitor leaves, one must pray about him with tears. When entering the monastery, one must confess everything one has done since infancy to the spiritual father or the abbot, as to God himself. Remembering how John baptized with the baptism unto repentance, and all came to him confessing their sins. The Studite recommends a monk to go for confession to one of the brothers, chosen by the monk himself and not by the abbot. He emphasizes, though, that confession before the abbot still remains the ideal. If you have obtained faith and trust in someone from among the brothers, so that you reveal before him your thoughts, never cease to go to him and confess thoughts which come to you every hour and day. Let everyone go to the abbot for this practice. But since some, by their great weakness and mistrust of the abbot, avoid it, we allow this by condescension. Continuing, Symeon the Studite says that a monk must preserve trust in his spiritual father. Even if you see that he fell into harlotry, do not be scandalized, because this will not harm you. We must not pass from one spiritual father to another, otherwise neither the first nor the second of them will trust us. And we, having become accustomed to passing from one to another, will not cease to inquire about stylites, recluses, and hesychasts, and will not trust in anyone. One must regard one's spiritual father as a saint and not conceal from him any thought, Symeon the Studite emphasizes. The obedience to the abbot or spiritual father must be absolute, right up to death if he commands so. The revelation of thoughts must be done every day, and what is said by the spiritual father must be received with full confidence, as from God's mouth. A monk should not ask someone else whether his spiritual father is right or wrong. Apart from the revelation of thoughts, Symeon the Studite suggests daily self-accusation before sleep. When the day has finished and the evening has come, speak to yourself as follows. How, with God's help, have I spent this day? Perhaps I condemned someone, or hurt, or scandalized, or killed spiritually, or looked passionately at someone's face, or disobeyed the superior over work and neglected it, or was cross with someone, or when attending the office occupied my mind with useless things, or being oppressed by idleness, left the church and the office. This is a kind of confession, but accomplished face to face with God. Symeon the Studite also provides some recommendations to the spiritual father concerning the direction of his disciples. The spiritual father, he says, must avoid any thought of distrust towards the disciples, especially if they go for conversation to someone else. If the disciple in his turn begins to distrust the spiritual father for any reason, such as jealousy of other disciples or false shame in revelation of thoughts, the father must recognize it by the expression of the disciple's face and by changes in his external appearance. The remedy for such disciples, says the Studite, consists of assiduous prayers with tears, increase of love, frequent exhortation, bodily consolation, and frequent conversations, sometimes gentle and sweet, and sometimes severe. Only the one who has tested these means in practice can write of them in such a manner. The mention of the bodily consolation, among other remedies, is noteworthy. It again shows the realism of Symeon the Studite as spiritual director. According to the monastic literature, the first step of monastic path is renunciation of the world. That is how Symeon the Studite understands it. Brother, perfect retirement from the world is the complete mortification of self-will, and then dispassion towards your own parents, relatives, and friends, and renunciation of them. Besides, it is necessary to be stripped of all property and forget all faces which you used to love dearly, whether bodily or spiritually. It is necessary to bear in mind that after your entering into the monastery, all your parents and friends died, and to regard only God as the superior as father, and to regard only God and the superior as father and mother. This passage is nothing else but a summary of the traditional monastic approach. According to the Studite, a monk must be a stranger not only to his relatives and friends, but also to every brother of the monastery. He must not have a particular love for anyone, but must regard all the brethren as saints and love them equally. This is the traditional theme of xenitia, which can be translated as a pilgrimage or living as a stranger. The Studite also follows his predecessors when insisting upon the necessity of non-possessiveness. A monk should not ask from the abbot anything beyond what is permitted. He must have only one set of clothes, and in case he wants to wash them, he must ask some other monk to lend him clothes until his own dry. Several times, Symeon the Studite mentions humility as an important ascetical virtue. One must do every good deed with humility, remembering the one who said, "When you shall have done all those things which are commanded to you, say, we are unprofitable servants. We have done that which was our duty to do." A monk must feel as one worthless, unknown, and non-existent. Regarding all the monks as saints, one should consider oneself as a sinner and think that all will be saved, and only I myself will be condemned in the day of the last judgment. Among practical things, Symeon the Studite gives some advice about how to treat people on various occasions. If someone comes to a monk complaining about the superior, the monk should console him, saying that such things happened with him also many times. If a monk is asked by his elder about certain brothers, he should keep silence, and if the elder insists, answer with humility. "Believe me, Father, I don't know, because I am a private person. I must look after my own negligence. All by God's grace are holy and good. However, everyone will reap as he has sown." In his ascetical approach, Symeon the Studite in general adheres to the teaching of ancient monastic writers, especially John Climacus, whereas in his understanding of spiritual direction, he is particularly close to the Studite monastic tradition. He was a practitioner and not a theoretician. This is why in his ascetical discourse, practical themes predominate. Since the ascetical discourse is just a collection of chapters, one cannot make a summary of Symeon the Studite's spirituality based on it. Neither can one expect to find there the whole spectrum of ascetical ideas which might have influenced Symeon the New Theologian. However, it is worth pointing out some features which were later developed by Symeon, who showed himself a faithful disciple and follower of his spiritual father. Symeon inherited from his teacher, and through him from the Studite tradition, the understanding of spiritual fatherhood as a relation between teacher and disciple based on absolute trust on both sides and absolute obedience on the disciple's part. The Studite argues against going to many advisors and searching for stylites, hermits, and wonder workers, and suggests confession to the spiritual father only. Echoing him, Symeon the New Theologian says, "Do not run searching for monks of renown, and do not scrutinize their life. If by the grace of God you have found a spiritual father, tell him alone your thoughts." The Studite identifies the words of the spiritual father with the words of God, when declaring that the disciple should regard everything said by the spiritual father as if it came from God's mouth. Symeon many times repeats that the disciple should account the words of his teacher as if they came from the mouth of God. All that the spiritual father orders should be regarded as coming from God's mouth. The disciple should confess to the spiritual father all thoughts as if to God. Symeon also identifies the spiritual father's will with God's will. "O Lord, send me a man who knows you, that by entirely submitting myself to his service and to yours, and by fulfilling your will by doing his, I may please you, the only God." If the Studite says that the disciple should not judge his spiritual father even if he sees him fallen into harlotry, Symeon almost repeats the Studite when prescribing, "If you see him eating with harlots and publicans and sinners, do not think anything passionate and human, but rather think of such things as are dispassionate and holy. For with these thoughts, see him condescending to human passions. Even if you see with your eyes, do not believe at all, for the eyes too make mistakes, as I have learned through experience." The Studite refers to confession before the abbot as a norm, but he also allows confession before one of the brothers, presumably one of the simple monks and not necessarily a priest. Symeon also understands the service of the abbot as first of all spiritual fatherhood. However, Symeon is known as a writer who with particular zeal defended the right of non-ordained monks to be spiritual directors and to confess people. The personality of the Studite, who was never ordained, stood always before Symeon's eyes as a living confirmation of this theory. He writes, "I too was a disciple of such a father who had not received an ordination from men, but who, through the hand of God, that is the Spirit, enrolled me among his disciples." In his understanding of monastic life in general, Symeon also comes very close to the Studite. Both regard monasticism as renunciation of the world and renunciation of oneself, which consists of mortification of self-will, deliberate deprivation of all property, renunciation of parents and friends, living as a stranger, humility, and abstinence. Whereas the Studite speaks of the complete mortification of self-will as a retirement from the world, Symeon builds a whole theory of life-giving mortification, zoopion necrosis, on this saying, After quoting literally the Studite's maxim, Symeon continues, "O blessed voice, or rather blessed soul, that was granted to become thus and to be separated from the world. It is to these and to those who are like them that Christ our Lord said, 'You are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world.' Do you then, brother, refuse to be humble and submissive, afflicted and dishonored, despised and reproached? But if you refuse this, how, tell me, can you become alien to self-will?" Symeon then calls his listeners to imitate his spiritual father, but if they consider him a sinner or a fool, to imitate Christ himself. According to Symeon, life-giving mortification is deliberate death through the renunciation of self-will. Without this, one cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. The Studite then regards the deprivation of all property through its distribution to the poor as a necessary condition for the monastic life. He also suggests that the monk, when he has washed his clothes, should ask for other clothes like a beggar and pilgrim. Symeon says that a monk should bring all his property to the spiritual father and not touch it anymore, because from the beginning of his monastic life he must be and appear a beggar and a pilgrim. Symeon goes even further when he calls all Christians, and not only monks, to distribute property and become beggars. He who loves his neighbor as himself does not allow himself to possess more than his neighbor, and if he possesses and does not distribute without jealousy until he himself becomes a beggar, he has not fulfilled the Lord's commandment, Symeon says. The Studite taught his disciples to renounce parents and friends and to forget all faces which one used to love. Instead of parents, there must be only one spiritual father and God. Symeon followed this advice in practice when he rejected his father's admonition not to hurry to go to the monastery. He also returns to this theme many times in his writings. In his chapters, he summarizes Symeon the Studite's approach as follows. They who prefer in some respect their parents to Christ's commandment have not obtained faith in Christ. Renunciation and perfect retirement from the world, accompanied by alienation from all worldly things, customs, opinions, and faces, rejection of one's own body and will, in a short time will bring profit to the one who so hotly left the world. Seeing the sorrow of your parents, brothers, and friends about you, laugh at the demon which by every means devises this against you. But retire with a great fear and much zeal, and ask God diligently that you may reach the silent harbor of a good spiritual father. Symeon also develops the concepts of xenitia, living as a stranger, which he understands as crucifixion unto the world and the desire to be with God alone and the angels and not to return to anything human. Following his spiritual father, who advised the monk not to go to anyone's cell except the abbot's, Symeon writes, "Keep silence and detachment from all things. For in this true xenitia consists. Do not enter into the cell of anyone without the permission of your Father in God, unless you have been sent by the superior." The theme of humility, outlined by Symeon the Studite, was also developed by Symeon the New Theologian. After quoting his spiritual father's suggestion that the monk must be as one who does not exist, Symeon exclaims in the manner in which he usually presents the Studite's sayings, "O blessed words, through which his angelic life is proclaimed, which was above human life." Symeon understands humility as the imitation of Christ, who humiliated himself when people accused him of being possessed by demons, a deceiver, a glutton, and a wine-bibber. Our Blessed Father, writes Symeon the New Theologian, I mean Saint Symeon the Studite, heard the same accusations on behalf of us, or rather because of us. Extreme humility, when a man crucifies himself with Christ, is nothing else but life-giving mortification, through which he becomes a partaker of Christ's glory. The ascetical discourse by Symeon the Studite gives us considerable proofs that Symeon the Studite was a mystic with a deep personal experience. There is no systematic discussion of mystical matters in the discourse, but only several passages and remarks. However, they provide enough basis for us to state that the Studite was a direct predecessor of Symeon in this most significant aspect of the letter's spirituality. In the following passage from the ascetical discourse, is of great importance. When remembrance of this remains in you for a long time, then in your mind appears a radiance like a ray. The more you search for it, with great attention and concentrated mind, with much effort and tears, the brighter it shines. Shining, it arouses love for itself. Being loved, it purifies. Purifying, it makes you godlike, enlightening and teaching you to distinguish between good and evil. However, O brother, there is need for much labor, so that this radiance settles in your soul and illuminates it, as the moon illuminates the darkness of night. In fact, the most significant mystical themes of Symeon the New Theologian are outlined in this passage by his spiritual father. The similarity in style and terminology is also considerable. Symeon also uses the images of the moon and of rays when describing the divine light. The theme of the intense search for the divine light is very important for Symeon. He also speaks of different stages of contemplation, of the appearance of the light in the mind, of the love which the divine light causes, of tears which accompany the vision of light, of purification and deification as results of the contemplation of the divine light. The following passage from the ascetical discourse adds some details to the description of mystical vision. The latter is accompanied by spiritual joy, and it may be brought to an end voluntarily. The Studite writes, if in the time of prayer some other light begins to shine upon you, which I am not able to explain, and because of which the soul is filled with joy and desire for the best, and tears spring up with compunction, you should know that this is a divine visitation and assistance. But if it continues too long, direct your mind to something bodily. Through this action, you will humiliate yourself. If we compare this passage with what Symeon the New Theologian usually says, we will see that the latter also speaks of divine joy with tears at the time of mystical vision. When speaking of tears in Symeon the Studite, I mentioned that he regards tears as a means to mystical illumination. The connection between self-purification through repentance and mystical experience is emphasized in the following passage from the ascetical discourse. It is necessary, firstly, to purify oneself, and then to converse with the pure, as it is said. For when the mind becomes purified because of many tears and receives the radiance of the divine light, which will not become less even if one possesses the whole world, then a man willingly settles his thoughts in the future and contemplates it, as God shows it to him, and he rejoices spiritually about it, according to the apostle who said, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, meekness, temperance. In Symeon the New Theologian's mystical system, Contemplation is also a result of self-purification through tears and repentance. For this unceasing repentance, little by little, causes us to shed bitter tears, and by them wipes away and cleanses the filth and defilement of the soul. Then it produces in us pure repentance and makes us able to see the unsetting radiance. It is noteworthy that the only patristic quotation in the ascetical discourse of Symeon the Studite is from Gregory Nazianzen, the author to whom Symeon refers much more often than to any other church father. Symeon the Studite shows that patience in afflictions may cause mystical experience. Let us every day be ready to bear every affliction, remembering that afflictions are deliverance from many deaths. For that which eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man, is, according to trustworthy promise, destined to those who show patience in afflictions. The same conception we find in Symeon. Those who bear patiently every difficulty and affliction will see the promised land, that is divine light, he says. Symeon confirms this by his own experience. When I was in every difficulty and affliction, I saw in myself abundance of joy and happiness through the revelation and manifestation of his face. Having compared Symeon the Studite's ascetical and mystical approach with that of Symeon the New Theologian, we come nearer to understanding the reason why his influence on Symeon the New Theologian was so profound. The Studite was a mystic who could share with his disciple his gifts and introduce him into mystical life. In my study on Saint Symeon the New Theologian, which I undertook 20 years ago under the supervision of Metropolitan Kallistos, I attempted to prove that all Symeon's major ideas are rooted in the Orthodox tradition, and his teaching corresponds to the ideas of such preceding fathers as Gregory the Theologian, Maximus the Confessor, John Climacus, Theodore the Studite, and above all, Symeon the Studite. I affirmed that Symeon's theology was no more than a continuation and development of the theology of his predecessors. I also asserted that Symeon only repeated what the church fathers taught from age to age, when he preached in his own time and for his contemporaries the ideal of life according to the gospel. Nevertheless, Symeon remains a profoundly original author who made his own unique contribution to the development of Eastern Christian tradition. What distinguishes Symeon from other church fathers is his autobiographical approach to mystical themes and his extraordinary openness in description of his own visions of the divine light and his own experience of the presence of God. All the elements of Symeon's theological and mystical doctrine are deeply rooted in the tradition, but he lets it go through himself, integrating it in his own experience. He makes quite traditional mystical themes, tears, ecstasy, dispassion, deification, vision of light, highly personal. It can be added that among the Eastern Christian ascetical writers, Symeon was the first to emphasize the central place of the Eucharist in personal spiritual mystical life, giving it the key role in the cause of salvation and journey towards the union of man with God. He was also the first to point out to the vision of the divine light as the main goal of one's ascetical effort. He was indeed the first to speak of dispassion and deification in such a personal manner. Symeon's mystical theology is perfectly in harmony with the common fabric of patristic tradition. While he remains one of the most original writers, the Eastern Church has ever known. The study of Symeon from the perspective of his traditionality or non-traditionality has led me to come to a key conclusion concerning the very nature of Orthodox holy tradition. His case very convincingly shows that the cornerstone of the holy tradition lies in none other but the personal mystical experience of a Christian, the experience of direct relationship between God and the human being. The holy tradition cannot be truly orthodox if it is not based on the experience of meeting God face to face. Those who try to oppose the formal and rationalistic tradition of the church majority to the inspired mysticism of particular enthusiasts are deluded because they do not understand the very essence of the tradition. Such people, regardless of their rank or status in the church, in case of Symeon, just as in many similar cases, they were representatives of the official church hierarchy, seek by all means to preserve and safeguard what they believe to be traditional. Actually, they contribute to the distortion and corruption of the true tradition. If the tradition is deprived of its missionary and of its mystical and prophetic heart, it risks turning into narrow traditionalism that has nothing to do with the true Christian tradition, which is inspired and mystical. In studying Symeon's spiritual legacy, I have also come to a conclusion about the nature of mysticism within the Christian church. Namely, genuine mysticism is impossible without the context of the tradition. A real mystic is not he who sets his own experience above the church tradition, but he whose experience is in accord with the experience of the church in general and its best representatives in particular. The historic role of great Christian mystics was often that of defenders of the tradition and preachers of the ideal of life according to the gospel. This is why there was, as a rule, so much maximalism and radicalism in their views. But it was precisely this maximalism which was a source of inspiration for thousands of ordinary Christians, as it helped to keep the Orthodox tradition alive. In each era of Christian history, the Church has had, or rather had been granted, great mystics who, together with their experience, hand over their inherited ages-long tradition to their contemporaries and subsequent generations of the faithful. It is in this way that the golden chain of Christian sanctity, so eloquently described by Symeon in one of his works, is preserved and continued. The saints in each generation, joined to those who have gone before and filled like them with light, become a golden chain in which each saint is a separate link united to the next by faith, works, and love. May I thank you for your attention and patience.
Thank you, Vladika, for that very, very interesting account of the spiritual background to the writings of Saint Symeon the New Theologian. We do have Vespers in 25 minutes. No, 20 minutes. And so we have time for a few questions.
Thank you, Vladika, for that vivid picture of the relationship between Symeon the New Theologian and his spiritual father, the Studite. I have two questions to ask. First, what is a person to do if they cannot find a spiritual father? And second, is there not a danger in this extreme dependence of the disciple on his teacher of keeping people in an infantile state so that they do not take full responsibility to stand before God in their own conscience?
I believe that the advice that is given by Symeon the New Theologian in this regard cannot be applied universally. It seems to me that, as in many other themes that he develops in his writings, his approach is highly personal. He was one of the fortunate monks who found a spiritual father whom he deeply trusted, whom he deeply loved, and he deeply venerated him. And he believed that it is possible for everyone, or at least for every monk, if he would search diligently for a spiritual father, to finally find one. He, as far as I know, does not even discuss the situation in which someone would search for a spiritual father and would not find one. As also he does not discuss the situation in which someone would not contemplate the divine light, because he simply believes that if someone wants to see the divine light, he will see it. I believe that what he writes in this regard is indeed coming from his personal approach, from his personal experience, and that unfortunately it doesn't always work the same way with other people as it worked with him. Therefore, if, for example, someone is not able to find spiritual father, which is the situation of many people in our times, then the guidance should be sought, as I believe, in the Gospel and in the writings of the Church Fathers. I do not see any other source of inspiration or of guidance for monastic life. Incidentally, in my doctoral dissertation, which was supervised by His Eminence, Metropolitan Kallistos, I mentioned one personal experience which relates to the very beginning of my monastic life. At that time, I happened not to find a proper spiritual father, and my attempts to find one failed. So what I did, I was reading Saint Symeon, I was reading Saint Isaac the Syrian, and I wrote some quotations from these fathers on the walls of my cell. And it was a good exercise, and also it was quite interesting for me to discover these quotes and then to rediscover them as I read them on the walls of my cell. After about a year of this exercise, the entire walls of my cell, it wasn't quite big, but still it had 4 walls, as you normally have in your cell. It was full with patristic quotations, primarily from Saint Isaac the Syrian, whom I found very helpful at this early stage of my monastic life.
Thank you for your very precious words. I humbly ask you a piece of advice, if I dare say, and I'm using your words. You mentioned something like doubtful orthodoxy. I would love you to tell me a bit more about this. And linking to your yesterday's talk, which in a way was very helpful, of course, as well, talking about your ecumenical approach. How can I actually come, and this is a very kind of private question, but I think we are facing many of this. How can I certainly come in a humble and submissive way to coexist in this spiritual or divine joys that you so beautifully describe, still keeping in the Orthodox tradition that once I choose for myself after being a Catholic before, facing strong opposition in daily life, and I'm talking now about someone who lives in Paris, and you may see what I'm talking about, which really we experience so much more every single day, literally, linking on, of course, basing on the Bible, but I feel it's sometimes we kind of lost, really, and I would love you to talk to me about this. Thank you.
The environment in which we live is, I believe, very hostile to the ideas which we may find in spiritual fathers, in spiritual writers like St. Symeon the New Theologian. And if one would try to apply his various pieces of advice to a contemporary situation, especially of those who live in the world and not in a monastery, then in many cases it would simply be impossible. The situation has changed drastically from the times of the Holy Fathers like St. Symeon, like his spiritual father, and we live in a totally different world. But what remains the same is Jesus Christ. What remains the same is his gospel, his commandments, his admonitions, his worldview, which was transmitted from him to his apostles and then through the apostles to the future generations of Christians up to our generation. And as the Holy Scripture says, Jesus Christ is always the same in any time and in any epoch. And we know from the experience of people whom we were able to meet in our life that it is possible, even in our time, to reach sanctity, to reach deification, to be filled with the presence of God. And many of us have known Father Sophrony, whom I would personally consider a direct heir to the tradition which is described in Symeon the New Theologian. He also had this succession of discipleship from Saint Silouan. And in many ways, the relation of Father Sophrony to Saint Silouan is very similar to that of Saint Symeon the New Theologian to Symeon the Studite. So it means that, of course, in the monastic context, the experience which is described by Saint Symeon is not peculiar to a particular period of time. It can be repeated again and again, and in fact it is repeated again and again. So this golden chain of sanctity, of which Saint Symeon so beautifully speaks, it continues up to our days. And we are able to meet people who are really saints and who are venerated as saints. During my own life, I met 3 persons who are already canonized, and I met at least 2 more who I am sure will be canonized very recently. So sanctity is an experience which can be lived through in any epoch. But of course, the circumstances do not affect us in the positive way, the circumstances of the current world. So my only advice would be to read the gospel, to see how Jesus Christ related to the people, how he reacted to what he saw and what he heard, how he taught his disciples, and how his disciples then, through the Gospels, taught us to live. And I believe that if we are intended to follow his teaching and his commandments, no external circumstances can become obstacles for this.
Well, I think we ought to close here because it's nearly 20 minutes to 6, and that gives us only a few minutes to get down to the chapel. So once again, thank you very, very much for that inspiring talk.